I now call on our guest speaker, Geraldine Mooney Simmie, and just by a couple of brief words on Geraldine. She's a senior lecturer in the School of Education, Faculty of Education and Health Sciences, University of Limerick, where she lectures in policy studies to doctoral students in education. Prior to taking up her lecturing post in the University of Limerick, Geraldine was a physics and mathematics teacher in Clontarf, Golf, and an active member of the ASTI. She served 10 years on secondment with the Department of Education and Skills as a Resource Development Officer with Transition Year Support Team and Second Level Support Service in schools in 13 counties from Cork to Donegal. She was a research officer for 1 year with a Teaching and Learning for the 21st Century project, School of Education, NI-UI Maynooth. I give you Dr. Mooney.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. Mayor, distinguished guests, ASTI members, tá anó hasarim a bheagwibh an tróna álinse I gcilárna chun de círí agus seansmach caintliv. I particularly want to say a word of thanks to Ed Byrne, your ASTI President, for the invitation to speak with you here this evening. I want to begin my talk by saying that I stand in solidarity with your strike action in relation to the payment issue for new teachers coming into the profession at different pay scales, and in relation to your concerns around the junior cycle reforms, for which I have published some papers. In this talk, I intend to give you a brief overview of the political background to the kind of teleology of certainty that is masquerading at the moment as education. I want to look at local work packages and the dangers associated with them for the profession. I want to speak about the epistemic dominance of the OECD in 30 countries now, where the Irish government and 29 other governments around the world pay the OECD for the privilege of coming to do their standardised tests. I want to speak about the research findings from qualitative scientific studies that are coming out from all over the world at the moment, from the UK to Australia, from Sweden to New York and to Chicago, that are actually telling us that the intensive labour and bureaucracy that is happening for teachers in these reforms is far from the promise of teacher autonomy. And finally, I want to finish then by saying something that has puzzled me for quite some time, and that is who benefits from the reforms as currently stated and who stands in their way. And I particularly think the question, who benefits, cui bono, is one well worth asking, because once you find out that people benefit in many, many different ways, you begin to understand the silences that accompany these changes. So I want to title my talk, Is Teaching Nearer to Poetry Than to Physics? And if it is, then what kind of appropriate inspection should it have? Should it be the new quality management and technocratic kind of tick-the-box inspection that is currently happening, that has been reported by Professor Kathleen Lynch and others in UCD in their book in 2012? I've given you the reference for all of these in my talk, which is going to be on the ASTI website. I want to critically question the teleology of certainty that is embedded in the language of all education reforms that have emanated from the state since the collapse of the economy in 2008. Professor Timothy Snyder, a history professor from the University of Yale, explains a teleology as a portrayal of the present with a step towards the future that we already know. A certainty, a speaking of the future as if we already know with scientific accuracy how the future is going to pan out. The very arrogance of that. The very arrogance of a statement saying that we're going to be number one in 10 years' time. So as you can imagine, what is actually happening within these policies is we need to hold a mirror to history. And when we hold a mirror to history, we need to be far more cautious and more careful. The fall of democracy in Europe in the last century, in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, was brought on by a teleology of certainty that offered a utopia. People believed that if they did X, Y and Z, that they would reach a perfect future. And then Europe fell into fascism, communism and authoritarianism. It appears as if we all have drawn the wrong conclusions from the fall of communism. Our new politics of end of history has resulted in a self-induced intellectual coma, where we are now saying that there's no alternative. So in this regard, I salute your moral courage in speaking truth to power. It is all too easy for the critics to say that the ASTI teachers are stuck in their ways and afraid of change. I can testify to the nonsense of that. I spent 10 years working in service with teachers in transition year support and in the second level support services in 13 counties from Cork to Donegal. I watched teachers walking the extra mile for their students, working with minimalist resources and working conditions. I was a teacher of young people myself for 15 years. I taught physics and maths and science in Coláiste in Galway City, so I'm a great lover of science. But I am quite horrified at the concept of teaching being regarded as a hard science, as an evidence-based practice entrapped inside an iron cage of rationality. I was an active member of the ASTI, and I understand your rationale for teacher solidarity, for working conditions that have been made by national contracts of agreement and not by local, flexible work packages. Sadly, this is happening all across the Western world at the moment. National agreements that have been fought for long and hard by teacher unions are being torn up in favour of local, flexible working arrangements. As you can imagine, the outcome of this is facilitating a precarious working conditions. The language of teaching is becoming resplendent with words like facilitation and scaffolding. We're now being told we're guides on the side. It is as if sooner or later the teacher can start withdrawing from their students, from the sustained, emotional, messy and intelligent dilemma work that is teaching, and walk away and let the student be self-regulating. It is not by happen chance that public sector employers want to set teachers' pay and conditions in different remuneration packages. This is part of the teleology of the marketplace, the political movement to the right, and the teleology of certainty. That aim is to break the solidarity between teachers and set up competitive staff rooms. I feel you will be heartened to know that a recent strike in Norway in the last year, where local work packages were brought on the table by the government, the teachers in Norway have been engaged in a strike that was supported by the public and by the parents and guardians and by the pupils, and the government had to take the package off of the table. So it would be only too glib for me to say you've a habit since you've been on strike of seeing off a lot of ministers for education. You've seen off Richard, you've seen off Rory Quinn, sorry. Freudian slip. You've seen off Jan O'Sullivan, and I know we've a very seasoned politician in Richard Bruton, but we don't know how long he's going to have the education portfolio. It is a stark reminder to all of us that we all are in education for a very brief time, and our aim must be to support and play our part for young people and the young teachers coming into the profession, to have a more thoughtful, compassionate and decent school system than the one we inherited. It is in fact our task as educators to leave the world with a more thoughtful, compassionate and decent society than the one we've inherited, and to make sure that we don't do this using a teleology of certainty as if we are arrogant enough to say that we know what the future will bring. So we are talking about the struggle for the curriculum. Professor Stephen Ball at the Institute of Education in London talks about the terrors of performativity wrought on by the hard evidence and data. And Ball recognises that when the stakes are high, that, guess what? The data becomes fabricated. Now, something in Ireland we're getting very used to on a day-by-day basis. So we have to ask the question with all the reforms, are we simply reproducing a circle of privilege? Will those who are already advantaged in the system continue to do better? And those who are already disadvantaged become designated disadvantaged? In the words of St. Paul, in the words of Marx, and in the words of Professor Peter McLaren from Chapman University in California, these new structural reforms are simply institutionalizing poverty and acting as a proxy for restoring advantage to a circle of privilege. At the moment, there appears to be little or no space in Ireland for a good critical debate about education and education matters, and about a wholesome view of education, as opposed to a slendered, reduced thing called the economy. In my day as an educator, I understood education to be a wholesome development of the young person. It was about social, cultural, moral, political, intellectual. It wasn't simply about the economy. And yet, the increasing epistemic dominance of the OECD in education is quite scary. The research done by Seller and Lingard in Australia and other intellectuals around the world is showing the OECD haven't taken over. They're driving 30 countries now. The E stands for economy, not education. And they're not doing any of this in hard ways. It's all done using soft surveillance measures. It's the language of evaluation, self-evaluation by the pupils behaving as customers. Remember, we're talking market forces here, peer pressure among colleagues, tick-the-box modes of inspection. And all of the time, the Irish government are paying the OECD for these standardised tests. For me, it appears that we're putting on the cufflinks on ourselves and we're paying for the privilege. And whether this policy rhetoric is accurately named self-evaluation has already been questioned by Dr. Alison Brady in a recent journal by the British Journal of Educational Studies. Burke and others in Australia, in a recent study, speak to these reforms and the human cost and the intellectual poverty that is happening as a result of them. So the OECD understanding of education is not, as you can imagine, shared by many philosophers of education, where they view teaching as far more nearer to poetry than to physics, a relational practice leading out the best and the potential of the young person for the betterment of society and a fair and just world. I want to briefly consider, for example, the philosophers Paulo Freire, a few philosophers. Paulo Freire is the one that has spoken in liberation theology from Brazil about education and the fact that education sits on a political platform. And let nobody tell you that they're involved in education and that they're somehow neutral. That he's talking about the radical unfinishedness of the human condition and the complexity of being a teacher in that space. Gert Biesta, the contemporary Dutch philosopher of education, is talking about the beautiful risk of education. He's not talking about instruction. He's talking about education. And education involves a risk. And the risk is there because, as Yeats put it, he says, education is not about filling a bucket, but it's about lighting a fire. The risk is there not because of an interaction between robots, but an encounter between human beings. We educate, he said, because we want results, but this doesn't mean an educational technology, some kind of perfect match between input and output, a sort of machine model. And the reason for this lies in the fact that if we take the risk out of education, he argues, there's a real chance that we will take out education altogether. And finally, I want to come back home to our philosopher, Mark Patrick Hederman. Mark Patrick Hederman was the former abbot of Glenstowell Abbey, and he's written a book called Education as Personal Relationship. And he's very interested in the concept of the life of dialogue and its importance in education. And he says that instruction can take place in a warehouse, whereas education is a miracle that happens between people who have the time and the imagination to engage at a deep personal level in the precise and creative activity that is educational relationship. So this brings us to the position of education as an evidence-based clinical practice is not regarded by everyone in the academy as the be-all and end-all way of looking at teaching. It is a contested concept. The seeking to use scientific inquiry to achieve clarity, to generate a black and white view by formula, a good and bad pupil, a good and bad teacher, and soon a good and bad school. So all of this actually shows, and you understand this more than anybody, is it's the inability to lean into the complex dilemma management required in teaching, to limit important experiences, to limit all the different ways of knowing that are important, that are wrought with uncertainty in teaching, creativity, trust, belonging, joy. And it rules out a whole lot of different ways of knowing. It rules out the art of teaching. It rules out the possibility of aesthetics. It rules out affectivity and the emotional and care work required in securing relationships of learning. And it ends up teaching about a very, very thin view of democracy. And so in a research study published in 2015, I analysed all the documents in the junior cycle reform. I found that they recalibrated the epistemic dominance of the OECD quite well. They were interested in reducing a broad and balanced curriculum, narrowing it into English, science and mathematics for standardised testing. I found that the junior cycle reforms were about achieving a skill set for a new type of self-regulating pupil, age 11 to 15, a self-regulating teacher and a self-regulating autonomous school. So many people will be so self-regulating there'll be no need for education as a public service shortly. None of these documents, interesting enough, mention the critical consciousness or critical skills needed for education as a social responsibility for public interest values. There's no mention of anybody asking anybody to question the system and what's actually happening. But what worried me more, what worried me most of all that I wrote about was that there was an outcome expected from these reforms that was going to segregate and separate schools from Cork to Donegal, from Galway to Dublin. And they were going to be subdivided, some designated adventurous. Others were going to be, I kid you not, others designated exploratory, and still others designated cautious. How would the founding fathers of the Republic of Ireland think if they were to hear this? An Irish school system operating on cruise control, the autopilot switch in the default position of a teleology of certainty, and it all run by an OECD data machine. So we look at other countries. Well, in the UK, reforms are charting aggressive policy drive, reducing teachers to technicians, making teachers' work practices intensive and bureaucratic, and telling them, of course, that they have autonomy. You can read about it in the research work of Professor Deborah Udell at the University of Birmingham. There is research by Perumel in South Africa reporting serious levels of exhaustion from teachers being put on a pedestal as quality teachers and given the job single-handedly of turning the country around from apartheid to a new democracy. The quality teacher is the answer for the politicians and the policy makers. Remember how clever a tactic it is. The quality teacher came from a piece of research conducted by the McKinsey report, but nobody ever asks who are McKinsey. McKinsey are a marketing corporation. Their clientele are governments around the world and people who want to get data about things using more efficiency and accountancy measures. And they've decided that if the quality teacher was able to do everything in their classroom and record it and give the data and give the evidence, then everybody else could just own a clipboard and a biro. And all everyone in the rest of the world has to do, inspectors, researchers, government ministers, everything, is just walk around and check that the quality teacher is doing what the quality teacher has been told to do. Lippmann charts oppression in the reforms in Chicago, where schools have been closed down and teachers fired to make way for a new gentrification of the city and a thriving market. A study by Piazza in New York shows a relentless economic agenda paying lip service to any notion of democracy. But the biggest scandal that I'm going to tell you about this evening, and I have loads of them, but I am limited to time, and the biggest scandal is from Sweden, where the policymakers and the politicians decided to introduce for-profit charter schools. And they now number 1,300 of a total of 3,000 schools in Sweden. But what happened, according to Linda Ronberg, who has published a paper on this, absolutely, Web of Science, high-quality paper. I've given you no other research because I know what they're going to do with my talk when I'm finished. And what the politicians and the policymakers did was, when they stepped away from their political platforms, they became the businessmen owning, managing and marketing their own charter schools and feathering their own nests. So even though we're trying in education, in the education field, to pump out our chests by saying that we're in the field of science, the field of science is moving on at rapid paces. The field of physics has undergone enormous changes in the last number of years. It's beginning to make education research look very outdated and far too simplistic. Carlo Rovelli has written a recent book called The 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, and he notes the definition of true genius. All of the physicists who have been true geniuses in the last century, that have really been genuine innovators in their society. And he has found that their genius lies in their willingness to embrace a sense of uncertainty and humility. It appears all too easy and politically expedient to draw up reforms that promise certainty. It appears a deeply flawed and shallow approach to the complexity of a rapidly changing world. So I'm going to ask the question, who benefits from the reforms? Well, it's clear that there's quite a lot of stakeholders that benefit. I suppose it's easy to say that the corporations and their immediate needs for the literate global migrant knowledge worker I'm not even sure that we'd even put knowledge in there. Maybe we'd say the literate global worker. That they want somebody who can sit into a team, ask no critical questions, work hard and be literate. The school managements are keeping quiet. The hierarchy of the Irish Catholic Church are keeping quiet, and they have an ownership interest in many of our schools. They all appear content with the reforms, but I guess they have a benefit from higher moral control of teachers brought about by new modes of bureaucracy and public accountability and tick-the-box inspection. So maybe they have something that will be a benefit to them. The education researchers at the university, sadly, there's also a great benefit for them. They're going to have some of these researchers at the university, when teaching becomes seen as a clinical practice and as an evidence-based practice, will end up getting terrific careers at the university, because teaching will be moving away from a softer, messier, more emotional teaching as poetry, and will be brought inside the iron cage of rationality of a clinical practice, where everything is visible and everything is countable and everything can be preferred as data. And we will have data and management in preference to dialogue and interaction. But don't get me wrong, the policymakers are not planning for the teachers any day soon to stop the emotional work and care work that they do in class. It's just that this work will now be unrecognised and unacknowledged within an inspection system that's focused on data. So who stands in the way? Well, clearly the Irish public, the parents, the guardians, the pupils, civil society matter greatly in this debate in education. You, the ASTI, stand in the way. And sorry, I do not agree with the Irish Times that said on Monday that you were merely a speed bump in the way of these reforms. Your solidarity is a threat to the introduction of reforms that will set teacher against teacher in a competitive marketplace in relation to pay, salary and conditions. Your salary is a threat to the introduction of reforms that will position our teachers as quality teachers, taking full instead of shared responsibility for education of all our young people, irrespective of context, socio-economic background, and irrespective of state funding and investment. Your solidarity is a threat to the introduction of reforms that will seek to collapse hard-won national bargaining of work practices, and that will allow local work practices that will introduce a competitive, precarious workforce. So, in conclusion, I've argued that teaching is nearer to poetry than to physics, and that teachers' inspections and fitness to practice need to reflect this. An education system that is no longer based on dialogue and interaction between all policy actors is a highly questionable system. What will be the future response of the Irish government? I have to ask the question, is it going to be similar to Shakespeare's King John, which was written in the 16th century, which says, "Bell, book and candle shall not drive me back when gold and silver becks me to come on." I wish you every success with the rest of your conference. Míle buíochas as Ucht Macree, go raibh maith agaibh.